Hello and welcome back for the fourth and final seminar in our How to Talk About Hunting webinar series. In the past three webinars, our panelists have covered so much information, and I hope you have been able to learn some new skills that will help you in whatever role you have in our professional hunting community. Here to present the final webinar today is Mark Dumaine Duda. Mark has been a great partner to the Hunters Leadership Forum and is the author of our book, How to Talk About Hunting. Mark is the Executive Director of Responsive Management. He has led responsive management since the firm's inception of 1990. During the past 31 years, he has conducted over 1,000 studies on how people relate to the natural resources and the outdoors. He's the author of over 150 publications and 4 books on wildlife and outdoor recreation, including The Sportsman's Voice, Hunting and Fishing in America and Watching Wildlife. Mark is a certified biologist whose research has been upheld in U.S. courts, used in peer-reviewed journals, and presented at major conferences around the world. His work has been featured in most of the nation's top media. Mark holds a master's degree with an emphasis on natural resource policy and planning from Yale University, where he attended on 2 academic scholarships. So without further ado, the man, the myth, the legend, Mark Duda.
Well, I'm a little bit disappointed that Peter didn't tell any jokes. I've gotten used to those corny jokes, so maybe I'm going to have to figure out a way to work some into mine. But thank you, Peter. And thanks everyone for attending the final session of our How to Talk About Hunting webinar series. We're going to conclude the series today by going over most of the important, what I call don'ts and do's for communicating about hunting. These are the core guidelines and best practices for effective communications about hunting. Well, I've spent my professional career over the past 35 years as a social scientist. However, my roots are in wildlife biology. Last week, I was really happy to receive my renewal from the Wildlife Society as a certified wildlife biologist. I always feel good when I receive that recertification. But as you guys know, classes in ornithology, the study of birds, are required to receive a degree in wildlife biology. One of the best stories I remember from school was about some students who were about to take a mid-semester exam on bird identification for a notoriously difficult professor. The students walked into the classroom only to find all of the mounted bird specimens covered with towels. Only the bird's feet were visible. "What's this?" asked one startled student. "What's going on here?" asked another. Well, smiling, the professor explained that to be a truly outstanding ornithologist, one had to be able to identify birds using only the shape of their feet. All of the students got silent until one frustrated student, it wasn't me, stood up and said, "This is ridiculous, I'm leaving." As a student walked toward the door, the professor bolted up to confront him. "You can't leave my classroom." Yeah, I can," replied the student. "Watch me." "Okay," said the frustrated professor, "but before you leave, you must tell me your name. I don't believe I remember your name." The frustration on the student's face turned quickly to a grin. He reached down, grabbed his foot with one hand, and pointed it with the other, all while staring at the professor. "You tell me what my name is, sir. You tell me." So I had to get my corny joke in. So I hope there's people out there smiling, but it wouldn't be the same webinar if we didn't have corny jokes to begin with. Let's look at what we'll be going over today. I'll start off with some data on hunting and sport shooting participation. I think this material is helpful for context and for understanding some of the challenges we're up against as we communicate about hunting. Then we'll move into the major communications don'ts and do's, starting with general guidelines and then getting into specific aspects. And just as a reminder, all of this information is directly based on the extensive national research that we conducted over the course of several years. These recommendations aren't a matter of my personal beliefs or opinions. And I'm really not trying to persuade you. I'm simply sharing what we've learned through the research. Finally, as noted, most of the data here is national in scope, built on research conducted throughout the country. But there may be situational, state level, or local variations on these themes. First, let's look at the state of hunting participation in the United States. As many of you probably know, hunting participation in the US has been trending downward since the 1980s. We did see an increase in hunting in 2020 during the pandemic, and this uptick has already been well documented, although it remains to be seen whether this is a temporary blip or not. There are a number of factors driving the decline in hunting, beginning with changing demographics in the United States. A few years back, we published a paper on what we called the dirty dozen threats to hunting, with the variables ranging from broad societal demographic changes like urbanization and modernization to more specific things like lack of access. The truth is, hunting isn't facing any one single challenge as much as it's changing and being threatened by 1,000 cuts. We have to use 2016 national survey data, as the next national survey won't take place until next year. But one thing to consider in measuring hunting participation is the issue of churn, which refers to the proportion of hunters who do not hunt each year. Whereas some avid hunters hunt each year, others occasionally skip years due to a variety of factors. Overall, as much as 1/3 of hunters do not hunt every year. As well, there are many people who identify as a hunter who don't go hunting as much as they used to. This means that in any given year, there are more people who self-identify as hunters than actually hunt. This is important to keep in mind when talking about how many hunters are really out there, with numbers ranging from 11 million to more than 40 million. Let's turn our attention briefly to sport shooting participation. Sport or recreational shooting in the United States has been increasingly important over the past decade. Outside of participation surveys, one indicator of the increase in sport shooting and firearm sales is the number of NICS, or National Instant Criminal Background Checks, which is a widely used industry proxy for gun sales. As you can see, the numbers of checks has increased rather substantially in recent years, to say the least. Additionally, since 2009, Responsive Management has conducted a sport shooting participation survey for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. The survey measures overall participation in sport shooting, as well as participation in a number of individual sport shooting activities. Over the course of these surveys, we've documented this surge in sport shooting participation. For example, in 2018, more than 52 million Americans went sport shooting, which was a sharp increase over 2009, when about 34.4 million Americans participated. We actually just completed the 2021 study, and the NSSF will be releasing that data soon. Well, I'm telling you this for a reason, because the increase in shooting participation and the decrease in hunting mean that the proportions of the overall population are changing. And keep in mind, these are all people who pay into federal aid and wildlife restoration. In this pie graph, you can see that target shooters who do not hunt account for more than half of the overall hunting and sport shooting participation pie. Here's a look at how the population has shifted since 2012. As you can see, the proportion of non-hunting target shooters is growing larger than just as the share of people who hunt without target shooting is shrinking. It's important to think about. We've also determined that new shooters, meaning the people who are taking up sport shooting for the first time, are demographically different than traditional or established shooters. For example, the more likely to be female, they're more likely to be younger. They're also less likely to hunt. It's an amazing graph. We actually just published a peer-reviewed paper on this topic in the Human Dimensions Journal. One of the big takeaways is that because of their growing numbers, non-hunting sport shooters today may be the most important target market for communicating about hunting. Overall, the fact that about 20% of the American public goes sport shooting makes sense when you consider that more than 40% of American households have a firearm. Surveys by Pew, Gallup, and Responsive Management all find household firearm ownership to be somewhere around this percentage, 42, 43%. Of course, there are government estimates that come out a little bit lower. But then again, it's always been challenging for the federal government to get an accurate read on these types of numbers in terms of gun ownership and participation in shooting. We're not quite sure why that's the case, but I don't know, maybe there's some reasons. And you can read that. Let's move into the don'ts and do's about talking about hunting. We'll start with some general communications guidelines. And the first, in my opinion, is probably the most important. Promoting hunting is not a matter of dramatically changing most Americans' hearts and minds. Rather, it's about affirming core values that they already have, such as about meat consumption, about the use of animals, about conservation, about family and friends, about ethics. It's also about bringing to the forefront widely held opinions and attitudes about hunting. Therefore, remember what I talked about last week at this time, what the current research says. Most of the American public consents to the use of animals, provided that the animals do not experience undue pain and suffering. Most of the American public approves of hunting in general. Approval of hunting specifically for the meat is even higher. The overwhelming majority of Americans consume meat and use products derived from animals. More than 4 out of 10 American households have a firearm, and more than 11 million Americans, adults, go hunting each year, with as many as 40 million Americans self-identifying as hunters, even if they don't go every year. The following specific advice for how to talk about hunting covers the tone and types of messages that resonate, as well as the words and phrases that I want you to use. First, be patient when speaking about hunting. While Americans care about conservation, they don't know much about wildlife, they don't know much about hunting, including even basic information about wildlife management. Consider that almost half of Americans feel that hunting as practiced today can cause some species to become endangered or extinct. Many people do not understand how highly regulated hunting really is. Remember the importance of ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos refers to credibility, pathos refers to emotion, and logos refers to logic. Building support for hunting depends on communications that incorporates all 3 elements. This extends even to the tone of discussions about hunting. Strengthening cultural acceptance of hunting requires advocates who are trustworthy and knowledgeable, but as importantly, empathetic. When talking to non-hunters about hunting, focus on common values and motivations rather than just providing information about hunting. Values shared by hunters and non-hunters might include self-sufficiency and ecological responsibility. Common motivations might include desire to maintain stable wildlife populations and healthy habitat, or even interest in finding healthy organic foods. Encouraging non-hunters to think about hunting in terms of values and motivations they share with hunters will help position hunting as an important method in achieving a common goal. View all communications through the animal rights, animal welfare, dominionism continuum that I explained in detail last week. Communications that are perceived as dominionistic, that is, exerting mastery and control over animals, will be rejected. Communications that are based on an animal welfare philosophy, that is, animals can be used as long as they don't experience undue pain and suffering, are more likely to be accepted. This includes how you talk about wildlife. As I noted, hunters must avoid inflammatory language that reflects a dominionistic attitude. Most importantly, hunters must not cede the middle ground of animal welfare to animal rights groups. Remember, hunting is consistent with animal welfare and the views of the vast majority of Americans. The animal rights philosophy, on the other hand, is not. Peer influence matters. Don't be afraid to talk about hunting. For many people, hunting must be demystified. Hunters should be open about the reasons why they hunt and the benefits hunting provides. Remember, the strongest correlation to hunting is knowing a hunter. Over and above being white, being male, and living in a rural setting. Talk about hunting, but within the best practices set forth in the book. You may wonder why I was telling stories throughout and why Peter was and why Sam was. Tell stories. A story is generally the best way to transmit information. Non-hunters will gain a better understanding of hunting through firsthand stories from hunters that emphasize knowledge and love of wildlife and nature. Maintain positivity in communications. A positive tone communicates openness, inclusivity, and optimism. Messages delivered in a positive tone will make people more likely to hear what is being said. Positive messages are more effective than confrontational messages, the latter often being distrusted and viewed with skepticism. Don't use inflammatory or defensive or combative tone. Don't denigrate or disparage someone for having a different point of view on hunting than you do. In posts and in conversations, communicate respect for others and for wildlife. It's okay to point out misinformation, but follow that with information in a positive tone. Assist people in making a direct connection to hunting. Share your game meat. Serve game meat at dinners and parties and help people recall relatives or friends that they know who hunt. Let's take a look at messages and outreach. We'll begin with the benefits of hunting in general. Focus on the benefits of hunting, not the fallacies of anti-hunters. Promotion of hunting should communicate the activity as a source of food, as wildlife management, and as a stimulus for conservation. Again, it's okay to correct misinformation, but quickly counter that with positive messages about hunting. Next, let's turn to the conservation aspects of communicating about hunting. Inform non-hunters that regulated hunting does not cause species to become endangered or extinct. Thinking that this is so is really important because it's some people's important factor in people's opposition to hunting. emphasized that no wildlife species in the United States has become endangered or extinct from hunting during modern wildlife management times. You probably take for granted that hunting does not cause species to become endangered or extinct. However, because of a lack of information, a lot of people outside our community think that hunting can decrease wildlife populations substantially or even endanger wildlife. Emphasize the integral role that hunting plays in conservation, both historically as well as today. Bridge the gap between hunters and conservationists who do not hunt. People who identify as environmentalists or conservationists, but who do not hunt, still share many values with hunters. For example, both groups care about the protection of lands from development for future generations. And both groups care about the health of habitat and species populations. This again highlights the importance of common interests and motivations that demonstrate that hunters are not out of step with mainstream America. Communicate that hunters were at the forefront of conservation. They've led species from being endangered to being healthy and stable. Hunters contribute to the long-term sustainability of both game and non-game species. This latter point is important, as a common hunting and anti-hunting fallacy is the idea that hunters only care about and provide funding for species that they can hunt. And of course, we know that this is not the case. Remember that every state fish and wildlife agency in the US is legally mandated to provide hunting opportunities. In some ways, you could argue that we are mandated to communicate about hunting. Again, remember that every state fish and wildlife agency in the US is legally mandated to provide hunting opportunities. Remember that an expansion of the conservation base benefits everyone, wildlife most of all. As state and federal agencies increasingly consider diversified sources of funding to pay for wildlife management, hunters should be prepared to welcome and encourage support from non-hunters who are similarly committed to conservation. Hunters and hunting conservationists are not working at cross purposes. Rather, they are enjoined by the common goal of maintaining healthy wildlife populations and habitats. Next, we'll take a look at the wildlife management aspects. Emphasize the ecological and habitat benefits of hunting over the human-centered ones, with the exception of food and mitigating harm to humans as acceptable human-centered reasons to hunt. One of the most important and supported reasons for hunting among those who do not initially approve of hunting is if hunting means that the overall health of the ecosystem will be better. This concept is entirely dependent on properly balanced wildlife populations. Some people will not support hunting even when it's used as a wildlife management tool, and even in the absence of hunting means that some species will become overpopulated. To these people, emphasize that harm that overbrowsing by deer or elk, for instance, can do to ecosystems, to the detriment of many other species. In these cases, ecological values trump human-centered values by a mile. Let's look at the concept of food for the table, and not just because it's noontime here on the East Coast, as the benefits of hunting. Among Americans as a whole, approval of hunting is highest when it's done for the meat. Of all the reasons people hunt, this one has the highest approval. 9 out of 10 Americans approve of hunting for food. Messaging to promote hunting should capitalize on the existing strong rate of approval among Americans for this motivation for hunting? Yum, yum. Are you focusing on the legs or the wine? I'm not sure. I'll torture you more. One way to emphasize that hunting provides food and to connect non-hunters with hunters is to share game meat with others. Sharing game meat with others. Many people prefer that the meat be from hunting rather than from modern farming. Hunting is a source of quality, organic, naturally replenished food from free-range animals. Talk about the quality of the game meat. Make comparisons of the life of a game animal versus the life of livestock on a factory farm. Hunting is integral to the locavore diet. The locavore movement, a blanket phrase describing support for any locally sourced food, including hunting one's own food, is considered by many to be a solution to the problem of food miles. That's the distance food travels from producer to consumer, and the problem of meat being produced through inhumane methods and even unsanitary conditions. As an element of a communications campaign, the locavore theme can unite disparate groups. These groups may include mainstream Americans, animal rights supporters, millennials, and even angler conservationists. The locavore theme can capitalize on a common interest and belief. Even some ardent animal rights proponents support the idea of people hunting for their own food. Next, let's take a look at ethics. Emphasize that hunting is highly regulated. Many Americans don't realize how highly regulated hunting is. Furthermore, and maybe even ironically, is the fund for these people that funds to pay for the enforcement of those regulations come from hunters themselves. Note that many Americans dislike social media posts of hunters posing with their animals. This is not to say that hunters should not post such photos, but the poses with the animals should show respect, and we need to think about the messages these photos convey. The rise of social media has also strengthened opposition to perceived trophy hunting by facilitating the rapid spread of images that appear to celebrate trophy harvests. The lack of backstory and context for such photos is an asset for anti-hunters and a liability for ethical sportsmen and women. Hunters should also consider photo subjects other than the harvested animal, such as nature scenery, fellow hunters and family members, and even prepared game and meals and people enjoying them. Link hunting in America to fair chase. Emphasizing fair chase is very important in all communications about hunting. Emphasize that hunters seek to limit the pain and suffering of animals. Ethical hunters track any game that they have wounded to complete the hunt. Hunters are keenly aware of the importance of a quick, clean kill. And remember what I presented last week. Nearly all hunters consume the meat obtained from hunting, upwards of 95%. Stress this in all communications that you do. Separate hunting in general from trophy hunting. Support for trophy hunting among Americans is low relative to support for hunting for any other reason. Only 1% of US hunters hunt primarily for a trophy. As I noted in last week's webinar, defining all hunting as trophy hunting is the most powerful communications tool of an anti-hunter. This is because of the pervasive perception. Please don't misunderstand me when I talk about this. This is the perception. I'm not talking about the reality. This is because of the pervasive perception that trophy hunting includes the wanton waste of wildlife, is done largely for human-centered benefits, and is responsible for the decimation of wildlife populations. In reality, that is not what trophy hunting is. However, this is a widely held belief among most Americans, and you must understand what many Americans are hearing when the term trophy hunting is used. Again, how many times have we said this? It's not what you say, it's what people hear. Separate poaching from hunting. Legal, regulated hunting is the antithesis of poaching. In fact, funding from hunters is what pays the salaries of game wardens and wildlife officers who fight against poaching. As part of this strategy, the phrase illegal hunting should never be used, as the illegal hunting of animals should always be referred to exactly what it is: poaching. Poachers are criminals, the opposite of law-abiding people engaged in state-sanctioned, regulated hunting. Finally, regarding ethics, we must always walk the walk. As Ann Causey points out, moral hunting requires not just a change of appearance or vocabulary, but a change in mindset, a deepening of values. Next, we'll look at customizing messages for certain audiences. We know the general messaging themes that work the best in support of hunting are hunting as a food source, hunting as conservation, and hunting as a right. These are the arguments that are most persuasive and that most move the needle in our research. The general messaging themes that garner the most opposition to hunting are hunting as a violation of fair chase, hunting being linked to trophy hunting, and hunting resulting in diminished wildlife populations. Advocates of hunting should be in the ready and knowledgeable about ways to immediately address each of these concepts. We must acknowledge that hunting participation may not be for everyone. Focus on getting support for hunting. And remember, it's not necessary to make hunters out of all non-hunters. Bridge the gap between hunters and non-hunting recreationists. While a relatively small percentage of Americans hunt, tens of millions of Americans enjoy hiking, camping, and wildlife viewing. Let's look at some guidelines related to persuasive strategies and tactics. Frame discussions about hunting around the need to manage and maintain wildlife in the first place. In other words, it's not a question of whether people should intervene in nature, but how. If people are receptive to the need to manage wildlife, hunting can be shown as a logical way to go about doing this. Keep in mind the difference between offensive arguments, which explain why something is good, and defensive arguments, which explain why something is not that bad. Defensive arguments can help push back against damaging claims about hunting, but offensive arguments are ultimately what change minds. This underscores the importance of using offensive arguments to clearly articulate the benefits of hunting. Don't let anti-hunters use offensive arguments to claim the moral high ground. Hunting advocates should lead with their own strong offensive arguments, explaining why hunting is the ethical thing to do. Practice refuting points made by anti-hunters using what we call link terms, which communicate the idea that, well, the thing that you think we cause, we actually prevent, or impact terms, which communicate the idea the thing you think we decrease, we actually increase. For example, a skilled argument in defense of hunting might point out that hunting, instead of leading to diminished wildlife population, actually funds wildlife conservation and ensures the sustainability of both game and non-game species. Link terms. Communicate that conservation requires a pragmatic focus on wildlife populations as a whole, not selective outrage over certain animals or events. Do not let anti-hunters frame discussions about hunting in terms of a narrow definition of morality. Let's examine a few key words and phrases about hunting that resonate. Well, you've heard this. When talking about hunting, use the phrase legal regulated hunting. It's well received because it separates ethical hunting from poaching. It conveys that hunting is carefully managed. Ecological reasons for hunting are well supported. Use terms that show the ecological benefits of hunting. Many Americans have a high concern for habitat in the United States. Use the term healthy habitat and emphasize that hunting plays a role in protecting healthy habitat. Healthy is a term that resonates with Americans. It's a powerful word. Use the word healthy whenever you can. Healthy wildlife populations, healthy habitat. The last major section we'll cover deals with formal communications programs and spokespersons for huntings. Programs to improve cultural acceptance of hunting should not be confused with programs to increase participation in hunting. These are different types of programs with different goals, objectives, and strategies. Formal communications programs in support of hunting must be developed through a deliberate, orderly, and scientific process. An entire chapter in the book is dedicated to how to do this. Deliberate, orderly, and scientific. Organizations, agencies should use social science research to develop and test messages, campaign themes, and other outreach materials. Don't wing it. Do not wing it. States should look to the models of the Michigan Wildlife Council and the Colorado Wildlife Council as effective creators of communications programs that build cultural support for hunting. They use a systematic approach. These organizations are also excellent models because they are funded through automatic surcharges on hunting licenses, meaning they have dedicated and reliable funding for their communications efforts. The most effective communications will be concise, positive messages. Such messages will make strong use of imagery and include language that we know resonates. Again, don't wing it. Incorporate an emotional component in messaging. Pathos, as we've talked about, or emotion, is one of the most critical components of any argument or message that resonates. Remember what I said last week. People aren't concerned with how much you know. They want to know you care. People aren't concerned with how much you know. They want to know you care. Positive communications are more effective than negative communications. This was confirmed in our research over and over again. It's okay to correct misinformation, but quickly turn your communications into the positive benefits of hunting. When possible, use the trustworthiness that Fish and Wildlife Agency personnel have among Americans in general, including non-hunting Americans. Personnel from both federal and state fish and wildlife agencies are seen as credible, especially game wardens and biologists in uniform. Unfortunately, some local sportsmen's groups and some nonprofits are just not as widely respected, as they generally are seen as having biases. Using an organization that is not trusted runs the risk of turning off people before they even hear our message. Diversity and spokespersons will help reach audiences that need outreach. People are more receptive to messages when they feel that they have a connection with the speaker. If hunting is to survive in the future, it cannot be viewed as a strictly white rural male activity. That hunting can be for everyone, and that hunting can be supported by everyone. I'm going to tell you something I heard 20 years ago. Don't remember anything about the focus group, but I remember this and repeat it often. As a Black woman articulated to me in a focus group 22 years ago, she said, "Mark, you buy things that look like you. You buy things that look like you." So I'm going to turn it over to Peter. I know we got a lot of questions and a few questions, just a ton of people, talking to us about the webinar and stuff. And so we've got a little bit of time. We can talk a little bit, maybe end a few minutes early, but let me turn it over to my friend Peter. Peter, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Yes, I appreciate that. We have received a lot of positive comments and thank yous. So thank you. I really appreciate all those kind words. We didn't receive a pile of questions. And the ones, about half the questions that we got are one-offs that don't relate to our book or our research. And I will address those individually. Just for the sake of time, we won't go into them. So if you're out there watching this going, "He didn't get to my question." Some of them were about hunter safety type of items, and I'm working with the IHEA to help get some statistics for you to help you address those concerns. I have two questions that kind of sum up a lot of questions. They didn't all come in exactly this way, but I've kind of rephrased them for the sake of time. So the first one, Mark, if you had 3 minutes to sum up the best of the best that came out of your information that you want to instill in every hunter's mind so they can be better educated to talk persuasively about hunting. So what would that be? I guess it's what Armand's called the elevator speech. What would you say? Not to put you on the spot.
Well, it's a great question. I'd say we had 4 webinars to try to do that. Actually, I'll first say that a lot of the information that we presented in 4 webinars only touched the surface of what's in the book. So I really would ask you all to take a look at the book, see all of the things that are in there. But I don't know, I'd be more general in that. I'd say that just as hunters need to develop skills for the best hunting techniques in the field, they need to do the same for the best techniques on how to talk about hunting. We can all relate to hunting. Successful hunters use techniques that are time-tested and honed through constant practice. Unsuccessful hunters wing it. In the end, it's about focusing on the benefits of hunting and staying positive. You just want to get out there. When you hear things, when people talk about hunting in a negative way, you take it personally. You take it in terms of human history. Remember, 99% of human history is through hunting and gathering. You might take it personally because your father or your grandfathers, your uncle or your mom hunted. You take it personally because it's what you love to do. So, but we can't go negative except for, obviously addressing misinformation. But in the end, I think it's about focusing on the benefits of hunting, staying positive, and really acting as good ambassadors for hunting in both our actions and our communications. And I'd say, remember, there's no need to be defensive, despite the picture that sometimes is painted in the media. Millions of Americans hunt. Millions and millions of Americans eat meat. I mean, think about the number that I presented last Friday. 95% of Americans eat meat. How can you be against hunting and still eat meat? And obviously there's tons of nuances in that, but hunting is not a fringe activity. In fact, think about 2020. If it's any indicator, hunting is becoming even more popular. Again, that's hunting participation. So I would say take all of those lessons that we learned and apply them to your communication skills and practice what it is that you do when you communicate.
Okay.
Armand, Sam, do you want to make any comments on that? We've got a few minutes here. It's nice time. We've got 13 minutes left and one question.
I would just agree with everything you just said. And I'd also like to remind people kind of the theme of what Armand and I talked about last time we spoke, in terms of the truth really doesn't speak for itself. You have to really arm yourself with ammunition so that you can fend off both misinformation, but also, and Mark did a really good job of stressing this, the positive information about hunting. When you sell hunting short, you're really not doing yourself or all those that love hunting any favors. You need to do what you can to become the best advocate you can be. And part of that is just informing yourself about the facts. And Mark's data really did a great job of educating me. I learned a lot in this webinar I didn't know about hunting. And I think I'm a better advocate for hunting now after hearing this presentation. Armand's?
What I would add to this is, I like that focus group quote that you found, Mark, where the person says you buy things that look like you. Well, your appeal to the middle, the people that are not animal rights people, but animal welfare people, it's interesting because you buy into friends and groups and stakeholders that are like you. So if you show the common ground that, hey, you're already a meat eater, you already agree with a lot of these things, even though you may not have thought through the practices, well, now just let me show you what some of the practices are. And some of them are hunting, and those very much relate to things that you already like to do and consume. So.
And I'd just like to add one last thing is, Mark isn't the only one that figured out that the battle is basically over the animal welfare. And more animal rights groups are starting to use the word animal welfare. And so we shouldn't just allow them to claim that space. First of all, it's not correct. But second of all, it would really benefit us not to allow that to be just taken without a fight.
Yeah, what a great point. I'll add something to that. Thanks, Armand and Sam. Really appreciate that. There was a little bit of concern when we were developing the book and trying to get the information out about, somebody trying to use this information against us. And we all had to sort of sit back and laugh and say, well, literally, what we're spending on this and is a drop in the bucket. When sometimes when I'm interviewed, people say, well, why are we sort of, we don't know as much probably about these issues as the animal rights groups do. And I like to respond to say that while they were sort of honing their communication skills, we were building wood duck boxes. So, I would argue that people who are against hunting, especially, some of the more strident animal rights groups, probably know far more than we do about the subject than we do. We're just beginning to understand what's going on out there. So we still need to be putting up wood duck boxes, but we still need to hone our communication skills. And then that's where we have one more question. That's where I want to sort of give a nod to Sam and Armand on this. I think even during this time, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, when we contacted them, these guys were the best there is. I mean, if you look up who the best debate teams are, it's Cornell. I feel sorry for their wives. I feel, never get into a debate with a guy who's been trained at Cornell. They're really good at what they do. And they're sort of the Alabama and the Clemson of debate. They're considered the best in the world. So I think that even in terms of our professional relationship, when we got these guys and they're like, okay, this is a job. We're going to teach you good communication skills and how to do things better. I think even just having worked with them, they've come a long way in terms of how much they support hunting and how much they didn't know, even as professors at one of the top universities in the world. So we've got, we've certainly made two more proponents in a much stronger sense. So thank you for that. Peter?
Great. Okay, and the next one, I like this one. Knowing what you know, if you could wave your magic wand, what would be the best outcome for the use of this book and these seminars?
I love magic wands. I want a magic wand.
Mhm.
So I don't know. For me, it'd probably be that we become more self-aware in how we come across to non-hunters. I think we should become more self-aware that words and behaviors in the field matters, as well as the realization of how little the public knows about hunting, that hunting is highly regulated. It doesn't cause species to become endangered. We know this as agency folks, as wildlife biologists, we know this, but a lot of people out there don't. So I think we need to be patient. We need to demystify hunting. We need to demystify wildlife management. I'd also add that I'd love for agencies and organizations to consider developing what I would call formal communications plans on how to communicate about hunting. Again, winging this stuff it just isn't the way to go. So we've been super successful in wildlife management and wildlife conservation practices because we approach these in a very scientific, deliberate, and orderly manner. And the same would be true as if we approach communicating about hunting, communicating about wildlife management in that same scientific and deliberate and orderly process. And I'd argue that the examples and the trendsetters for the Michigan Wildlife Council, for the Colorado Wildlife Council, should be a beacon for all of the other 48 state agencies, that we should have a wildlife council in every single state. They're doing a good job. The research shows that it's working. They have a dedicated source of funding. So that's how I would say, I don't want people to be self-conscious about themselves, but I want you to be self-conscious about the words and messages that we portray when we communicate about hunting. Sam, Hermans?
Okay. No, well, Sam, did you have
I think
something?
Sam's
Yeah, I
turning
was
his.
just gonna say that, I agree. People need to be self-aware. It's very interesting. If you meet someone that says, I don't really need to improve, there's an example of someone that's a good hint that maybe they're not self-aware. We can all improve.
You bet.
I'll just add a quick nugget, which is just that when I coach people and persuasion students, sometimes they come back as novices and they say, well, I said the right thing. Why didn't I win? And it doesn't work that way, because persuasion, you have to be aware of your audience. You have to know what they're receptive to. You have to have your messaging sort of organized. So everything needs to be set up, because persuasion is not a binary business. It's a business of working over and over again to get people to be on your side. And that takes work. So.
Great. Peter, why don't you wrap things up? I'll wrap it up on my part by saying, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for sitting in on this. Swanee tells me that we had, at one point in time or another during these, we had 900 different people attending this. I mean, that's just amazing. I think when we started, we thought we were going to get 50 or 60 people, and that's what we wanted. We thought we'd get the 50 or 60 right people. But the fact that, when we started this, 800 and up to over 900 people signed up and attended at one point in time is really an honor for you all to give us your time. We know you're busy, and we really appreciate what you're doing. So hopefully this was of help to you, and to my colleagues. What a great experience it was. So Peter, thanks a zillion. Sam, thanks a million and a zillion, and Armand's just fantastic work. I'm so glad that we were able to coax you away from all the other things you were doing and join the team. So thank you very much. Peter?
All right. Yes. Thank you, everybody, for everything you do individually in your professional lives to help out this hunting outdoor community. We're all in this together. We really appreciate your professionalism. Thank you for hanging with us for these 4 hours. We hope you learned a lot. Wrapping up, if you need any questions answered, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best to help you out where we can. You noticed that we were recording these. We will release the recordings in about a week. We'll send out links to all the people that registered. We would love for you to share that link with your coworkers and for other professionals. If you're in the hunter education community, I had a lot of questions from one state that wanted to have all of their volunteer hunter education instructors watch this, and it would have overloaded our system. So I asked them to hold back because we only had room for 1,000 people. So, but please share this recording. We want to get this message out and help people wherever we can. Also, Mark mentioned the wildlife councils in Colorado and Michigan. I have to give a big thank you to those people. They did a great job in helping educate me on some of these items and helping us prepare for some of this information that we sent out. So thank you. As Mark said, you are trendsetters. I think that's all I got. I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you for watching and take care.